Good morning to the European attendees. Good night to the American, and good afternoon to everyone from Asia. We have to slightly change the agenda because Dr. Wheeler moved to the United States, so he's full nights in Colorado, and so we will anticipate his presentation on the River Nile. And then we will continue with Dr. Ali Rhouma, who is our project officer, and then my presentation of the project, and finally Dr. Moni Omar from ICARDA. I guess we'll hand over to Professor Vergalli from FEMA, who is hosting this webinar virtually for a very short introduction, and then I will introduce a presentation by Dr. Wheeler.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I hope you are able to see my screen.
Yes, we see your screen.
Okay, perfect. Okay, as Fondazione Enrico Mattei Principal Investigator, I'm glad to virtually welcome you at the inaugural event of the Wholesome Project. FEMA was founded in 1989, is a non-profit international research center on innovative interdisciplinary research and on sustainable development, environmental economics, and also on energy economics. I would like to introduce you in this kind of virtual tour because it's not possible to be all together in this very beautiful headquarters in Milan. And so my idea is to bring you in this kind of virtual tour. But this is our library, and these are our beautiful sites in which is possible in the future be together. So we have to content ourselves with some pictures, looking forward to meet each other again and face to face when the times will allow it. So I show you last point in which is possible to see also where is the location on our site, that is very close to the center of Milan, close to a very beautiful church that is Santa Maria delle Grazie, in front of the Last Supper of Leonardo da Vinci. And now thank you very much for being here. And now I immediately leave the floor to our first expert speaker, that is Professor Kevin Wheeler. Thank you very much for being here from the University of Oxford. Now I stop my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sergio. Just quickly introduce Kevin. Thank you again, Kevin, for accepting the invitation. Kevin is a researcher at the Environmental Change Institute of the University of Oxford, and also principal at Water Balance Consulting. He got a PhD again in Oxford in 2017, and is a long-term expert of water resource management in transboundary river, with research on the Nile River starting since 2012. He's also associate editor of many journals, among which the Journal of Water International. So I leave you the stage, Kevin. Thanks again for accepting to be part of this webinar.
Okay, happy to be here. It's an honor to talk with this group. I've been looking forward to someday being able to visit Milan and your group over there. So we can do it virtually this time, hopefully in person at some point soon. So I'm going to start my presentation. Elaine, I assume you can hear me right now, right?
Yeah, we can hear you well.
Okay, and I need to do the right setting. Let's see. Okay.
Exactly. Now it's perfect.
Okay. I'm not going to make this talk super technical, because I think it's a fairly general audience, so I'll give a pretty good background into the Nile and the current issues, a little bit of past, present, and dive into the future and some of my research work. So I work a lot funding from the Oxford Martin School and the and GIZ funds a lot of this, but I work closely with the University of Khartoum. So my background is in water resource engineering from University of Colorado. I worked on Colorado River issues for most of my career, actually. But more and more, I've been getting involved in the policy, legal analysis, and international relations diplomacy. When I finally decided to leave consulting and go back to the university, I went to a geography department where I still pretty much act as an engineer, but I wrap it up in all the history and context. I work closely with this group of people, a lot with Jamal Abdo and University of Khartoum, as well as University of Colorado and Dale Whittington in North Carolina, and my colleagues in Manchester and Duke as well. So the work is done through a pretty extensive network of research universities and centers, both in around the basin as well as in Europe and the US, then also working with various ministries in Sudan and Egypt, friends in EME as well as NBI. So I'll do a quick summary of the past. At least since 1900, it's difficult to talk about the past of the Nile when it goes back so extensive. A little bit of the present with the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, and then the future based around a new paper we recently published in Nature on the future of the Nile. So historical context since 1900. Well, okay, a little bit earlier. Is one of my favorite old maps of the Nile or of the world at that time. Their perception. So a notion that the Nile was that Egypt was connected to Ethiopia by the mountains of the moon, and up here that's the delta of Egypt, and here's the mountains of the moon where the lakes or the highland lakes would discharge into the Nile. Okay, I'm gonna just make sure really quick. Elena, can you still hear me? I'm gonna make sure that my audio hasn't gone out.
Yes, it's perfect.
Okay, great.
Very good.
Okay, so here's the physical layout of the Nile. So our sources of the Nile are Lake Victoria and Lake Tana, and from Lake Victoria flows the Victoria or Albert Nile, going into the Sud wetlands, which about half of the water is evapotranspirated and flows northward as the White Nile to the city of Khartoum. And from Lake Tana flows the Blue Nile and meets right in the center of the city in Khartoum, and then flows northward from the main Nile through the very large dam now, the High Aswan Dam, and up to the Mediterranean. Here's the border between Ethiopia and Sudan. And for context, the Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is right just upstream of the Ethio-Sudanese border. The hydrology of the Nile, just to get an idea where the water is, the thickness of the lines represents the volume of water, more or less. So we can see that, okay, about 30% of the water that flows up to Egypt comes from the White Nile, about 57% from the Blue Nile, and about 13% from the Abara River for the total inflow into Egypt's Lake Nasser. And about 53% of that comes above the location of the GERD. So as much rhetoric happens about Ethiopia controlling the waters of the Nile, the GERD actually can control a little over half of the waters flowing into Egypt, but it can't control the other part. So our historical context, through a lot of the 1900s, the UK controlled much of the area, of course. In 1902, a treaty between the UK and Ethiopia, where the Majesty Emperor King Melenik engages himself to the government of the UK not to construct or to allow to be constructed any work across the Blue Nile, Lake Tana, or the Sobat, which would arrest the flow of the waters into the Nile, unless without agreement from the Crown and from Sudan. Now, the word arrest, when you translate that word to Amharic, that really translates to totally stop. So Ethiopia's argument is as long as they don't totally stop the rivers in the Blue Nile, they can construct what they want there, and they don't consider this treaty valid anyway, given the handover of colonial powers. But during that time, the British control of Egypt, they really introduced extensive scientific measurement, construction of the first major dams in the river, the Low Aswan Dam and others, and large irrigation schemes. So kind of brought in a lot of the modern development that we see today. So a lot of it was, or one of the major names, a gentleman named Edwin Hurst. And Hurst developed really one of the first visions of how the Nile might work together as a coordinated system. So they perceived building a smaller storage dam near the inflows into Egypt, as well as controlling the flows coming out of Lake Tana and the flows coming out of the Victoria Lakes, and then cutting a large canal through the wetlands, the Sud wetlands, to increase the water. And at that time, it was really primarily about extending the irrigation in Egypt. And of course, as time went on, that changed, but we'll get into that. So as colonial independence occurred, Egypt and Sudan gained their independence, and in 1959, reached an agreement between the two of them called for the full utilization of the waters of the Nile. So between them, they allocated 55.5 billion cubic meters to Egypt and 18.5 billion cubic meters to Sudan, and did not account for water to the other countries. However, I do always note so the question is, what happens when the upstream countries start developing, like Ethiopia? I do want to note that in that 1959 treaty, they did actually include some foresight on that, but they basically said the two republics, if other riparian states claim a share in the Nile water, the two republics have agreed they shall jointly consider and reach one unified view regarding the said claims, and they would essentially divide that share, deduct it from equal parts between Egypt and Sudan. So they did account for some of that, but they basically bound themselves to agree to make an agreement between each other before they would concede to other countries. So the modern historical development in the Nile, in 1902, the Low Aswan Dam was constructed, a very small head dam. And then in 1925, the Sennar Dam and Jebel Alouya Dam in 1937 basically controlled again, small dams, but basically controlled regulated some of the flow to extend the irrigation season into Egypt. And then also open up the irrigation into the Jazeera scheme that's located between the two rivers. Now to jump ahead, the 1959 agreement initiated the construction of the High Aswan Dam, which was completed between 1960 and 1970. That dislocated about 50,000 people, where they agreed to construct the Kashmir Dam in Sudan, as well as construct the Rosaires Dam in Sudan. So those were all done under the 1959 treaty. Now, more recently, the Meroe Dam was constructed on the Fourth Cataract of the Nile in 2009 by Sudan, which is the largest hydropower dam in Sudan. Ethiopia, meanwhile, has gotten into their construction on a larger scale. In 2009, the Tekezi Dam on the Tekezi River, which flows in the Abara into the headwaters or the tributary to the Nile, and the Tanabellas project in 2009, and more recently the Upper Abara Satit in Sudan. And now finally the GERD, which we'll go through the timeline on that again. So today Egypt is the three countries I'll focus on. Egypt, dominated by the city of Cairo, and the tourism wrapped around the Nile is obviously a major economic driver. In Sudan, large irrigation areas. Sudan has always seen themselves as the potential breadbasket of Africa, being able to provide food throughout Africa if they could harness the water. And Ethiopia remains as one of the poorest countries in all of Africa, underutilizing a lot of their water resources that evapotranspirates and leaves the countries. So here's our hydrology of the Nile. Right around the dam location, we can see from 1900 through the present, essentially it stayed the same. There's been large cycles going up and down. The notions of 7 years of drought, 7 years of flood that you'll see in biblical times, that's got some hydrology behind it potentially. Now up on the up at Aswan, if you naturalize those flows, remove the effects of upstream management and diversions, we see a slight increase, and there's a lot of good science saying that may continue to increase, or at least more variability. However, on the inflows, we see a remarkable decrease, and a lot that's due to the upstream depletions within Sudan. So the driver behind a lot of the development, well, we'll start out looking at the energy consumption. This is the energy per capita in all the Nile countries. And of course, the line on the top is Egypt. So Egypt by far uses the most amount of electricity per capita of all of the countries combined, really. So if you were to take away that Egypt line and you look at the demand per capita, we see two lines that are accelerating fairly fast. That's Ethiopia and Sudan on their way up. So the increase in energy use per person. But still, there is in Ethiopia and in Sudan, particularly in the rural areas, a very low electrification rate. Sudan, this most recent data, around 30% electrification rate within the rural areas. Egypt, on the other hand, is almost completely electrified for the last decade or so, even though there's still intermittent power outages for sure. And Sudan certainly has been on the upswing as well, but still looking for more energy sources. Now, Ethiopia, because of their position in the mountains, the highlands of Ethiopia, they really have developed hydropower as their primary source. So we can see this distribution where the blue represents the percentage of energy sources from hydropower. And we can see Egypt over time has really decreased their reliance on hydropower and increased their use on natural gas. Well, Ethiopia and Sudan are both very, very dependent upon hydropower. So that also does raise concerns about what happens in the face of climate change and how to harness and control that water and continue supplying electricity. But the economic growth in Ethiopia has been tremendous. Over the last several years, well, they claim over 10%, they'll probably be a little less than that, but a very, very strong economic growth through the years. Of course, very challenged now by the current situations, but overall, Ethiopia has been growing very, very rapidly. So that's driving a lot of the drive for development here. So to dive into the present, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, it's not hard to open up the news and see many, many articles in all different news sources. What's going to happen with the dam, the conflicts between Egypt and Ethiopia in particular, the feeling of water insecurity, the feeling of being threatened, Ethiopia arguing this is a regional development project, a lot of rhetoric on this. So here's the GERD location. So we have abbreviated as the GERD just above, and it consists of a large reservoir with about 74 billion cubic meters of storage. About 59% of that it would really be active storage or could be active storage, with an average annual inflow about 49. So that controllable zone is about 1.2, is that ratio of active storage to average annual inflow. Now the GERD is a one large dam at about 155 meters of height, as well as a saddle dam that's a very long saddle dam, about 5.2 kilometers, and only about 50 meters in height, but it provides a lot of that extra elevation on the top. So the Ethiopian justification for the GERD, well, about 5,150 megawatts is the generation capacity. That's changed several times through the years, but that's the latest now. It'll be over 15,000 gigawatt hours per year of energy. And a little bit of a context here, up until, it's a little bit out of date slide here, but up until 2015, they were generating less than 5,000 gigawatt hours per year. After the GBA, it should have gone up. I haven't got to figure out those numbers yet. And then there'll be a large surge, 15,000 gigawatt hours thereafter. So really tripling the amount of energy generation, double to triple the amount of energy generation within Ethiopia. So a tremendous step change is what's promised by Ethiopia. Now, it's not just for the benefit of Ethiopia too. Regional power, being able to sell power, particularly to Sudan, Djibouti, and Kenya. There are already power lines in place and power lines being planned into these countries and plugging into the East Africa power pool, where a much larger area could purchase power from Ethiopia. What are the impacts within Ethiopia? Well, the official environmental study, impact study, identified over 4,000 people that would be permanently displaced from the dam footprint area. One researcher, Jennifer Vilio, I can never pronounce her name, she projected about 15,000 people would be affected from that area. But that is one area that Ethiopia certainly has been focusing a lot of their efforts on relocation. But I don't know too much of those details. The potential effects to Sudan. So first off, the benefits of Sudan, they see this as a large opportunity to increase their irrigation potential. Once the waters of the Blue Nile are controlled, they could potentially divert a lot more water. They just don't have the topography to build the sorts of dams that Ethiopia does, so they see that as a large potential benefit. At the same time, if we watched the news recently, the incredible amount of flooding that's happened the last couple of years in Sudan, they see this as an opportunity to improve their flood risk management, as well as decrease their sediment transport into their own hydraulic infrastructure, their canals and reservoirs, which they spend a lot of money removing that sediment every year. They also see it as an opportunity for improved hydropower generation from their own dams. They'll be able to operate their own dams more efficiently, basically, with a more steady inflow into them. However, there's negative impacts as well, potential risks, a loss of flood recession agriculture, particularly around their reservoirs, and loss of nutrients, and really an unknown impact on the ecosystems. Not a lot of baseline studies to know what the impacts on the fisheries will be, as well as the rest of the ecosystems. Now, the potential effects of the GERD to Egypt, first off, the benefits. Now, certainly having a dam upstream increases, having that additional storage could increase the water security within Egypt, or within Egypt, if it's coordinated, used in a coordinated way. Absolutely. Decreased sediment load that currently accumulates within the Haifa Dam. And then potential risks, of course, are the fear of a loss of security, not having control of those upstream dams. Decreased hydropower generation. So really the dam operations becomes the negotiation space, and has been. There's political sides and legal sides, but certainly the dam operations is very fundamental in the negotiations themselves. So in the history, in 1964, Ethiopia requested the U.S. to conduct a study where they identified dam locations. In 2011, the dam was announced at a cost of $4.8 billion. The design and impact assessments were not made available to the public. An international panel of experts was convened four people, internationals, as well as 2 people from each of the 3 countries, convened and wrote a joint report. And they agreed to hire external consultants to do joint studies on how to fill and operate the dam. Well, in 2015, a declaration of principles was signed, and there was really 2 interpretations of this. So Article 5 of this, a principle to cooperate on the first filling and operation of the dam. Well, it says the 3 countries, in the spirit of cooperation, will utilize the outcomes of the joint studies to be conducted and recommendations. Now, they agreed on the guidelines and rules of the first filling of the dam, which shall cover all different scenarios in parallel with the construction of the GERD. So the term "in parallel" was interpreted in 2 different ways. The GERD certainly allows the GERD to be the construction to continue during these studies. However, one interpretation was the GERD should only be filled after the studies are complete. The other interpretation is the first filling of the GERD is part of the construction process. So several attempts to reach an agreement. By 2016, the European consultants were contracted to do studies on that. Essentially, those by 2017, that transboundary EIS had pretty much been abandoned. A lack of being able to establish what a baseline would be. Ethiopia doesn't agree that the status quo should be a baseline. By 2018, they convened a national independent scientific group where researchers from the countries got together to try to test different ideas, but there were certainly many conflicts along that path. And in 2018, the project stalled with about 65% completion. Ethiopia was really in a precarious situation politically, internal conflict. A new prime minister was brought in, Abiy Ahmed, ended the protracted war with Eritrea, publicly announced the GERD had been delayed. And at the same time, the dam engineer, Semeni Bakali, a very great gentleman, who was found deceased within Addis Ababa, the official line being self-inflicted harm. But of course, that's debated in other circles. And also said that the Metec, the company that was driving the mechanical electromechanical equipment was required to subcontract that out because that had been seen as a failure. So by 2019, really strong politicization of the issue. Egypt asked for international involvement or mediation. Ethiopia had been insisting this can be solved internally, but by October, November, Egypt submitted a full proposal for how to fill and operate the dam. Ethiopia rejected that. Egypt requested that the US and the World Bank intervene as mediators. Ethiopia agreed to have the US and the World Bank in as observers, and that launched a new process. It was often called the Washington process, which in a very Trump-like style set out a very intense 2-month timeline to try to resolve the issue. They held 12 meetings between November of 2019 and February of 2020. A full proposal was presented on how to fill and operate the dam that was substantially aided by the U.S. Treasury, not the Secretary of State, interesting enough. And the Ethiopia, they refused to attend the final meeting, and Egypt signed it. Ethiopia didn't attend. And they really claimed that the USA had overstepped its role as an observer and believed that they were being biased in favor of Egypt's position. So much more recent efforts. Sudan tried to lead a facilitation effort. Egypt really brought this issue to the UN Security Council last summer. In June, there was a Security Council session where they talked extensively about this. From July, African Union tried to facilitate, and then ongoing public relations campaigns are going on by both Egypt and Ethiopia, trying to garner support and explain their positions. But back in last July, heavy flooding occurred, and they were ready to fill the reservoir. Ethiopia had been saying they are going to fill the reservoir. They're not going to stop over the negotiations. So even though no agreement was reached, they did capture the first small amount of water, 4.9 billion cubic meters, to be able to test the first turbines, which they haven't actually tested the turbines yet, but it did create the first small amount of water. There's a very small amount of water in the overall system, but they did it without an agreement. Very brief impacts in Sudan on their water intakes, but there was plenty of water. There's enormous flooding in Sudan occurred, as well as the full Aswan Dam is very full. And then the U.S. started withholding aid to Ethiopia as a result. So really did sort of vindicate Ethiopia's argument that the U.S. had been acting in a biased capacity towards Egypt, unfortunately. So key questions: how should the dam be filled? How might it operate after it's filled? How should the downstream reservoirs adapt? And what agreements would be needed to accomplish this? And how do you go about that? They've been wrestling with this for a decade now. So I'm going to just really quickly step through some of the future and how I look at this in terms of using modeling tools to facilitate negotiations. So a paper called Understanding Managing Risks in the Nile. So we look at 3 different eras: the filling period, what the new normal might be after the GERD is filled, and what the risks of a multi-year drought would be after the GERD is filled. And I do this similar to Andrea's team there, using water resource models. I use a system called RESERVOIR that's developed and designed in the U.S., but it really integrates all different types of river management for multiple purposes. I spent a lot of time in the countries working with the stakeholders, working with the people in the water ministries, working with the universities. Basically, as I develop this tool, they tell me everything that I did wrong with it. We fix it together, and then they get the tools in the end, and hopefully use those for their own. And they do use those for their own studies. So it's a network model. Reservoirs, links, nodes and really build around the notion of accuracy, transparency, and flexibility, so people can actually use the models to facilitate negotiations if and when they use them, and being able to integrate all the logic of existing operations, whether you embed future international treaties or local agreements, water rights systems, but a very, very flexible platform to be able to integrate any sort of operational policies. So in the filling of the GERD, just for some of the geography here, some of the engineering side of it, this first amount is 4.9 billion cubic meters. It's a large elevation change, but it's a very small amount of water. Only about 9% of the water at the GERD site on average, or 5% flowing into Egypt. So that would be the first year. The second year would be capturing an additional 13.5 billion cubic meters. And years 3, 4, 5 onward, how fast to fill up the remaining 30.9 billion cubic meters. Really, Ethiopia plans to do that within a 3-year period. So basically 5 years total. They would be flexible. It seems to be able to extend it to 7 years. And then thereafter, they would reach an elevation of 625 meters. And thereafter, they would operate it within that zone. Was sort of their notion, was what they're putting on the table for negotiations. Now, meanwhile, in Egypt, we're looking at the Aswan Dam here and the historical elevations of the Aswan Dam storage. And we can see it's very high, very close to the maximum elevation, which is 182 meters. Now, if the reservoir falls below 147 meters, that's a critical situation for Egypt. Every year they bring it down below this level, in theory, to 175. We can see they've been keeping the reservoir quite high to try to avoid bringing it down too low. And they do have an operation plan that allows the reservoir to, they would cut back releases if the reservoir falls into these critical zones, where they cut back by 5%, 10%, 15% on their own populations. Just gonna check really quick, make sure I haven't lost people here. Okay. I'm assuming people can still hear me.
No, we are here. We hear you very well.
There's always that risk when you're doing these presentations.
No.
Everybody's you lost your connection. So, so the question is will the reservoir fall down during? How far will the reservoir fall down during the filling period? So, using primarily, I drive it on historical hydrologies, since we have a very robust record for the Nile, and we can see a few different things. The Aswan Dam will absolutely fall to levels that haven't been seen in recent decades. The most likely case is it won't fall so low that shortages will be required by Egypt. Because the Aswan Dam, Egypt has prepared well. The Aswan Dam is overflowing right now, so they probably will not need to cut back their releases. However, they might choose to do so. Possible precautionary measures to avoid any risk of hitting that low level. And of course, there is always a very low probability that the Aswan Dam would fall to critical levels and large shortages, and that would be a very bad situation. But I emphasize that the filling is likely going to be okay, but they do need to focus more on the drought issues, which we'll talk about in a second. So in the new normal condition, after the GERD is filled, we really look at, okay, how would operate under normal conditions, anywhere from a minor drought to wet conditions. And we can really see under the sort of new normal condition, there won't be a strong need for close coordination. It'd be great if there were. We could make it much more efficient if the reservoirs are coordinated. But in general, under average conditions, it won't need a lot of additional coordination. The Aswan Dam will probably operate lower, without a doubt. But the inflows to the Aswan Dam will be more predictable, and the extremes will be somewhat buffered for sure. So minimal risk to Egypt during this time, as long as there's not increased upstream development. Primarily, the risk is not necessarily Ethiopia developing, but also how Sudan would develop. So the implications of this new normal. Well, the GERD outflows would essentially equal the inflows minus the evaporation. Large benefits to Ethiopia and Sudan, minimal risks to Egypt. But there will need to be good data exchange, particularly between Egypt or Ethiopia and Sudan for dam safety, but minimal coordination needed. However, the risk is, of course, not having an agreement when you need it and becoming complacent. Because when a multi-year drought hits, that's when we can see the critical situation will occur. Now, what might happen during a drought? Well, we expect certainly the falling of the reservoir. So I often look at a repeat of the 1980s drought, the devastating drought in Ethiopia in the 80s. So how would the reservoir fall? How long would it stay? Would they stay low? And how would the reservoirs recover? So if the 1980s drought were to occur without the GERD, what would happen? Well, this is a line. This is a simulation of what the GERD storage would be, and if it hit that dotted line at the bottom, that would be the critical level. And we can see it would become very, very critical even without the GERD. It could get very close to that bottom level. Now, of course, you have the drought onset period, drought recovery period. The Aswan Dam would probably already fall below the 3 drought management policy trigger lines, and it would result in Ethiopia or in Egypt implementing their drought management policy and implementing shortages downstream. Remember, they released about 55.5 billion cubic meters, and they would potentially be cutting back 8 billion cubic meters each year, getting near critical level. Now, I'll just put one scenario. There's a million scenarios that we try out, but if Ethiopia were to release a constant hydropower of 1,600 megawatts energy generation, that would essentially shift those shortages further to the right. The orange lines shift over further to the right, and we can see on the onset of the drought, it would decrease the shortages to Egypt. And on the recovery of the drought, it would delay some of the recovery. But overall, we'd have to say that this is a good situation for Egypt. In this situation, the GERD actually results in less shortages in Egypt. However, we can see an extremely contentious situation coming at hand here. If you look at the Ethiopian dam, so this is the storages in the Ethiopian dam. This particular scenario drains the Ethiopian dam all the way to the minimum operation level, and they struggle to recover because they're continuously releasing that 1,600 megawatts downstream. So this would probably be very unacceptable to Ethiopia to operate in such a way. They're going to want to retain much more of that water, which would drag on that recovery period even worse. So that recovery from the drought is something we really need to focus on. Both countries will want to recover. We can imagine both reservoirs being very empty and very low, and it'll be a prioritization. In which order should the reservoirs be refilled? Which needs are the most critical? Potentially assuring domestic supplies, assure reliable power generation. And really, we want to look at this in terms, not necessarily solving all the problems today, but trying to move further along this continuum. We're making incremental cooperation to build trust. So even if they could come up with a filling agreement for now, that could at least set the stage for operations later on. So I'll conclude here. So all I've talked about in this talk is, and they're talking about on the Nile now, has been operation as a single reservoir. Now, much of the studies that I have done and others have done have focused on multiple reservoirs, coordinating with Sudan's reservoirs and Egypt's reservoir, and certainly it could be a much more well-managed system if there's coordination. But it takes a lot of political will and a lot more than algorithms to generate these coordinations. So really, it's an intertwining of different ideas where the ideas come on the political side, the technical analysis goes back and forth and back and forth. And really, a lot of my work is building the frameworks by which negotiations can take place using technical tools, hopefully finding some solution in the end for an agreement. Ideas can come from a number of different sources. A lot of the institutional positioning can limit creative thinking, and you need these flexible tools alongside the negotiation process. So I'll bring it to an end there, and there's several publications on there if you're interested in diving a little deeper, but I'll be happy to take any questions. Sorry if I went over time.
Thank you, Kevin. Not much over time, that's perfect. I will leave space for questions. Maybe we can organize the question and answering time using the chat. If anyone has questions, please write them in the chat and I will report the question to Kevin. While we're waiting for a question, I have one question. You mentioned that actually among the positive impact of the Grand Renaissance Dam for Sudan, there is also the reduction in sediment transport. But is this just a matter of siltation of the downstream reservoir? Because I mean, sediment are pretty key elements in river system balance. So
yeah, well,
sediment is not. Yeah.
Yeah, you'll see you'll see positive and negative impacts from that lack of sediment. I mean, so essentially for everyone's edification, when dams start to trap the sediment, they release very clear water, and that creates a lot of scour downstream. Basically, clean water will pick up the sediment and start to transport it downstream. So you have a lot of potential scour issues downstream. Then you also lose the sediment that contains a lot of the nutrients that would be used in the agricultural areas. Now, what's happened all over the world as people have built dams is essentially that that gets replaced by fertilizers. So large-scale fertilization of irrigation areas. That's what happened in Egypt. Essentially, there's no sediment transport in Egypt at all after the Aswan Dam. All the big floodplains that relied on that sediment, they no longer receive the flooding, and they don't receive sediment. So really, it's about how does that affect within Sudan, and that sediment transport or siltation, the suspended sediment. Currently the Sudanese dams are operated very much to manage sediment because there's so much that comes down from the Ethiopian highlands. They have to open sluice gates at the bottom of the reservoirs to push out that sediment as much as they possibly can. They slam those gates down at the very end to try to capture the water, but the reservoirs are constantly filling up with sediment. Then they spend a lot of money cleaning out their canals of the sediment that's accumulating as well. Sudan sees this as a huge windfall for them, being able to capture a large portion of that sediment. Now, it won't be perfectly clean water coming out. There's a lot of other tributaries, but it'll certainly reduce a lot of that sediment buildup in Sudan.
Thank you. We have another question from on the chat. He's asking whether the authoritarian regime in one or more countries is relevant in doing your analysis.
They're all relevant. They're very, very strong regimes there, and they all have, whether they're authoritarian or not, they all have very strong interests in coming to agreements. But that certainly creates a lot of the positionality, the often exaggerated rhetoric of what the benefits, or exaggerated rhetoric of what the risks are going to be. That certainly creates a lot of challenges to be able to get hard, good science on the table and not talking at the extremes. Data sharing is incredibly difficult in those countries. There's a lot of public data out there, but it's very difficult to get. A lot of the studies that we've been doing, countries don't want to share data, and sometimes it's actually in their interest to share data, but they often do not do so. Obviously, the changes, the GERD was announced at a very delicate time in Egypt during their revolution. Ethiopia, even though they've been planning on it, they sort of sprung it on the world stage during a political turmoil in Ethiopia in 2011. Last year, Sudan underwent their revolution. They're in a very delicate state right now, hopefully rebuilding, improving relations with the U.S. And Ethiopia right now in a difficult situation in Tigray. It's all intertwined. It's very difficult. You can't separate the politics from the technical side of it, of who supports this dam and who doesn't support the dam. But certainly, as the regimes have changed through time, new people come in with new positions, but hopefully improving. We'll see.
Thank you. And then we have Matteo Giuliani from my group asking whether, along the line of my first question, the potential benefit generated by the GERD for Sudan can somehow change the power balance and the in the basin, meaning that Sudan can try to create a coalition with Ethiopia against Egypt in this kind of negotiation? I mean, is this an option we should explore, or not?
Well, so, I mean, certainly Sudan, the electricity benefit in Sudan is very strong. I mean, the numbers off the top of my head, but significantly better hydropower generation, both at Rosaires and at Meroe in particular. A lot of my friends at the Meroe Dam are very excited about having the dam upstream. They can operate it much more efficiently. Where I think some of the interesting movements will come is Ethiopia has the potential to generate a lot of electricity. Sudan has always said they want to build more dams. Everybody has a lot of plans for dams. Does it really make sense to build those new dams in Sudan now that they could purchase electricity from Ethiopia? Sudan is always caught in the middle, but they're also the kingmaker in this situation, as Anna Cascal labels it. They long ties with Egypt. They really do not want to alienate their long-term partner with Egypt, but they also recognize the benefits of aligning with Ethiopia. Purchasing that electricity from Ethiopia would certainly avoid them from spending the capital costs of building those dams. But of course, those dams aren't only about electricity, it's also about national projects. So even if technically they don't make sense, politically, internally, they can be justified. But of course, Egypt wouldn't want Sudan to be creating more evaporation ponds as well. So there's a lot of incentive to not build those dams in Sudan. Now, Egypt has said that there's always been the big question on whether Ethiopia would sell the power to Egypt via the African Power Pool. So far, Egypt has refused that idea. They don't want to be dependent on Sudan, on Ethiopia for both their power and their electricity. But that's obviously one of the best opportunities for cooperation. Now, whether Sudan would to what extent Sudan would support that, we don't know. Egypt is willing to build the power lines into Sudan to sell their power to Ethiopia, interestingly enough, to compensate for power losses during the filling times or during drought times, but they haven't stepped forward and said we will buy electricity from Ethiopia yet. But it's a great question. It's definitely how the power and the power get distributed are the key questions in this.
All right, thank you. And I guess we have the time for the last question. Again, Matteo. Matteo is asking, do you know if the water demand side of the problem can further contribute to finding an agreement? Meaning, if energy demand downstream, the Aswan Dam decrease, for example, because of improved efficiency in irrigation, is the conflict going to decrease in your opinion, or the impact of water demand change are not so big to change the balance? This is quite relevant for our also project, which is basically focusing on reshaping water demand.
My colleagues in Egypt always remind me they use a lot more water than 55.5, and they do. The runoff water is used over and over and over again. So the increasing in salinity concentrations, increasing in the agricultural runoff, and the pesticides and fertilizers. So they basically every drop of water that's lost gets amplified through the system. And they argue that they need every drop of water right now, and they need much more. And if you look at Tony Allen, a lot of the virtual water trade, he argues that there's so much water currently being imported into Egypt via virtual water. He argues it actually technically isn't going to make that big of a difference because they're just going to have to import more food as opposed to growing the food. Now, of course, that comes, and we engineers love to work on the numbers, but it's the political cost of those changes. Obviously, the stability of Egypt, in large, revolves around the stability of agriculture. And so, even if it's not a large volumetric change, it could cause significant political tensions in Egypt. Now, if efficiency improvements, absolutely. There are extremely inefficient practices. We know that growing rice in the Delta has been traditional for a long time. Egypt has been working very hard on trying to increase efficiency. cutting back the rice production, I've heard by 50%, trying to essentially force farmers to grow different crops. You guys might have much more accurate information on that, but it's a very politically difficult thing to do, to force farmers to change what their current practices are. I've a lot of friends that live down in the Delta tell me, yeah, they change their practices because they're told to, but they're just either secretly trying to go back, or they go back every chance they get to growing what they're accustomed to growing. It's a very, very difficult process to change agricultural practices in any part of the world, much less a place that's been growing some of the same crops for thousands of years. But that's certainly where the forefront of the opportunities are. And not only in Egypt, in Sudan as well. The current irrigation systems in Sudan, they were built initially by the British. They're very inefficient currently, but some of the new irrigation systems in Sudan are incredibly efficient. Laser level efficiency, and those do hold tremendous potential. So it's a question of, will Sudan increase the efficiency of their current systems, or will they build new systems that are very irrigation efficient? So I think there's a lot of opportunities there for what this group is talking about, to develop a lot more efficient mechanisms in all countries.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Kevin. We have another question, but I guess we need to close here because we are a little behind of time. And so I want to thank you again, also considering the different time zone where you are now. So I wish you a good night.
I think I'll try to stay up for a while. So.
Okay, thank you. So we will keep in touch and keep you up to date on the next step of the project.
Okay, sounds good.
I would like now I'm gonna show you quickly. Awesome. Yes, thank you, Elena. Unfortunately, I don't have control on the presentation because I just updated my Mac and we discovered that Big Sur is not yet online with GoToMeeting. All right, so Awesome is a PRIMA project, and it's basically focusing on building a decision analytic platform with the purpose of assessing water ecosystem, food and energy portfolio, where for us a portfolio is basically a mix of action at different levels. So there are regional policy, for example, energy policy, food policy, climate policy. There are intervention and action at the river basin scale, what we call a meso level. So very similar to what Kevin has been showing to us, operation of water infrastructure, building of new infrastructure, filling of new infrastructure. And then there is a local scale where we want to explore to which extent new technology in the crop production chain may increase efficiency in terms of water, energy consumption. So indirectly reducing water demand have an impact also on the ecosystem. So we are exploring at this level the potential role of hydroponics, aquaculture, and the mix of them called aquaponics, to see whether the use of this type of technology can allow us to produce more food with the same amount of water and energy. So starting from the last level, we're gonna have two pilots where we practically try different type of crop, different type of technology. There's quite a big word out there. And the idea is to get from these pilots precise information and parameters to be used at the meso level scale, where we can say assess different scenario of food improve productivity. through aquaponics and see whether these can reduce water demand, and this is in line with Matteo's question before, and whether this reduction in water demand can help bring volume of water that can be used for supporting the ecosystem or reducing the conflict at the river basin scale. Of course, everything will be informed by what's going on at the macro scale, for which we have a general equilibrium model considering a large part of the Mediterranean area and implementing regional policy to inform the lower level scales. So this is just the geographical mapping of this methodological conceptual scale into the region. So the two pilots will be probably one close to the coastline, with the idea also of exploring the use of the salt water for feeding, for irrigating this hydroponics structure. The other one will be in Cairo, in a surrounding area, and probably there will be some option of using also drainage water there. The idea of using these two contexts is also because as a part of our response to the ongoing pandemics, we decided to enlarge a little bit the scope of the project and also include consideration of shortening the food production chain. And so having this kind of plant very close to the food demand, so to big cities, is one of the options we want to explore. Please, Elena. Yes. So this is a little bit of a technical representation of what we plan to do. So we will have global future scenario of climate, population growth, and social technological development, which will be feeding our three-level modeling chain. There will be a sort of soft integration across all these three levels. So we do expect the macro level to provide information to the meso level, and the meso level being informed by the macro level to run this river basin management model, and then provide feedback both at the macro and at the micro level. Okay, you see we have a number of different models being used in the different level. Please go ahead, Elena. Okay, well, that's something I guess most of you are pretty used to see. The idea, of course, is to use a multi-sector trade-off type of approach where we try to go beyond the traditional least cost analysis. And so we look at trade-off between minimizing cost, maximizing food production, and at the same time minimizing impact on the ecosystem. And so the idea is to explore this multidimensional space where we will also be adding consideration, as I said before, of food security and say robustness against pandemic stress in the future. And I guess this is more or less all about our project. Of course, there will be also an important aspect related to stakeholders' participation, so engagement and participation along the line of a long tradition in our project and previous project. We already started trying involving stakeholders at different level, from say institutional level down to the farms and level. Okay. Right. If you have any question about the project, there is a very nice website which has been just launched. And maybe we will give you more information about this later, and we will. Right, you have it here, and basically there is a Twitter account where you can follow us and be updated as new reports and finding papers are being published.
I want to thank you, all of you, for participating in this webinar. I want to first thank you, FIM, for hosting the webinar, Lenia and Marta for supporting the organization and the communication, Elena from Polimi for the fundamental work in putting everything together, our two guest speakers, Kevin Wheeler and Moyer Omar. And of course, I want to thank you, Ali Rhouma, our project officer, for its time and presentation.